ever since a bunch of colonists threw British tea into Boston Harbor, there had been escalating tensions between the two sides. This would lead to the fighting at Lexington and Concord, and then what really ignited the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775. It was the Revolutionary War's first major battle and its bloodiest. Best-selling author Nathaniel Philbrick joins me to discuss how a bunch of mostly farmers, merchants, and sailors stood up to Britain's army and created a nation. The book is Bunker Hill, and Nathaniel Philbrick joins me in the studio. Nathaniel, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
So why Boston? Why were tensions so high there and not in any of the other colonies?
Well, there were tensions throughout, but it definitely Boston was the hot spot. And I think it had a lot to do with New England's kind of unique position among the colonies. Boston was founded by Puritans in 1630, and they had come to the New World to worship as they pleased, beyond the reach of the king and his bishops. And as a consequence, they were out there to do it on their own from the very beginning.
So they were just very sensitive to anybody telling them what they could or couldn't do.
And for more than 100 years, they had been allowed to do pretty much what they wanted, a policy that became known as salutary neglect. And so they were the least taxed, probably had the most freedom of anybody in the British Empire.
Do you think they were more violent than the other colonists?
Yeah, definitely. And it dates back to the Indian Wars of the 17th century. King Philip's War was fought in 1675 to 76. A third of the towns burned, just a decimating conflict. And that was just the beginning. There'd be a series of French and Indian wars right up to 1763 that kind of defined a militant culture in New England.
There was the Boston Tea Party. They dumped tea in Boston Harbor. Was that a planned event, or was it more mob violence?
It was pretty well choreographed, and there had been mob violence beforehand, mainly the Boston Massacre, where things got out of control, shots fired, people killed, and a lot of people dismissed it as mob violence, But so the Patriot leaders, when it came to the Boston Tea Party, wanted to make sure that people understood that this was being done for ideological reasons, even if that may have not been entirely the case.
I was going to say, was it ideological or was it some other reason?
Well, the issue was the taxation without representation. We've all heard that, but there were other elements to it. In actuality, Britain was selling the tea that it had always sold at a third of the price. It was a great windfall for the colonial consumer, but they made the mistake of having just a 3-pence tea tax on there. And so even though they were getting the tea for less, many of the colonists seized upon this as
oh, we're being taxed. That's not
right.
fair.
And the other story was that many of these leading patriots were merchants who had been importing illegal Dutch tea, smuggling it in. And with the reduction of English tea in price, they now were undersold. And so they were objected to it not only in ideological terms, but also because it undercut their profit margin.
So how did Great Britain see the people of Boston? Did they see them as a bunch of thugs that can't be reasoned with?
To a certain extent. And, what happened soon after the Tea Party was the tar and feathering of a colonial customs inspector named John Malcolm. And tar and feathering was not fun. It was brutal. In fact, John Malcolm, after having hot tar poured on his flesh on the coldest night of the winter, nearly died. His flesh came off in steaks, it was described. And word of this came to London just as Parliament was trying to figure out how do we respond to the Tea Party. And they responded by shutting the port down commercially with the Boston Port Act.
And so did that have a negative impact on Boston?
It did. It meant that many Bostonians lost their livelihood. And it also meant that Boston suddenly became this American-wide focal point. Charleston, South Carolina, to help the people of Boston, sent up sacks of rice. In Connecticut, people brought in sheep, so that suddenly Boston, Massachusetts, became this rallying point where 13 colonies that never before really had been on the same page were beginning to think of themselves as sharing in one colony's destiny.
I wonder, though, if the other colonies might have also thought, who are these thugs in Boston that are like provoking Britain, and we're all going to have to pay for it.
Yeah, and that was definitely a concern, even as late as the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And Samuel Adams, John Adams, names we've all heard, were down there. And what they were hearing was that many of the delegates from the southern colonies were fearful that if this came to blows, and let's say the colonies win, New England would then march against the colonies to the south and create a New England dictatorship of America. And this was a real concern. And so there was a lot of negotiation that had to happen.
Nathaniel Philbrick is in the studio with me. He's a best-selling author. The book we're discussing is called Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution. Who was Joseph Warren, and what was his role in the build-up towards war?
Well, Joseph Warren was the guy who you could say was really leading the on-the-ground revolution in Boston. The Patriots we normally associate with Boston, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, were away at the Continental Congress. So it was left to a 33-year-old doctor, a widower with 4 kids between 2 and 8, had a very popular, well-off medical practice, but he was also a charismatic, kind of swashbuckling leader. He'd walk into a room, and even if you violently disagreed with him on political terms, after a conversation with him, you couldn't help but say, I like this guy.
He's a politician.
He was a politician. He was born for it. And but he was also a legitimate ideologue. I mean, he cared about this. But he was also very personally brave. And as things became very tense in Boston and every other Patriot leader left, he remained. And so on the night of April 18th, it was Joseph Warren who gave Paul Revere the orders to alert the countryside that the British were headed to Concord. And, we all know Paul Revere, but who has heard of Joseph Warren?
Thomas Gage was the British military commander and the royal governor of Massachusetts. He didn't really want to be there, did he?
No, I had a lot of sympathy.
Probably no British guy wanted to take that post.
Gage very quickly realized that to serve in this kind of capacity was going to be the graveyard of your career, and many British officers were going to find that out in the 8 years of the Revolutionary War. And he had come in to put the lid on, to institute the Boston Port Act, take over as governor of the colony. And he might have had a shot at doing it if the Parliament had stayed with the Boston Port Act. But they then passed the Government Act, which basically shut down Massachusetts government and turned it into, something that was directly connected to the crown. And this just sent all of the towns, more than 250 towns throughout Massachusetts, which then included Maine, into tantrums. And they started insisting that that royal appointed officials renounce those appointments, and so that Loyalists began to flee their own towns and come to Boston as a place of refuge. Just ignited the entire province. And Gage quickly realized, it's not just Boston I need to control, it's the entire colony. And each one of these towns has a militia. They're armed. This is a lot more than I had bargained for.
And he didn't much like fighting, which
No.
seems like an ideal person on the Patriot side.
Absolutely. The Patriots were very willing to take the so-called law into their own hands. Gage was a kind, decent man who respected everyone's English liberties, even when it came to the Patriots. And so here he is, he's in Boston, and the Patriots are smuggling out cannons, muskets, gunpowder, and because there's no martial law, his hands are tied. At one point, they were trying to float a cannon out through, sneak it out at night across Boston Harbor. The tide goes out. It gets stuck. The British admiral sees it and seizes it. Well, what does the cannon's owner do? He takes the admiral to court, and the courts give it to him. And so how is Gage supposed to, stop this revolution when law is allowing it to happen?
There's a quote in your book. It says this: for Gage, the Patriots' complaints about British tyranny seemed utterly absurd, since British law was what allowed them to work so assiduously at preparing themselves for a revolution. Never before, and perhaps since, had the inhabitants of a city under military occupation enjoyed as much freedom as the Patriots of Boston.
Right. And I think this is a largely unappreciated aspect of our revolution. It's come down to American patriots versus British tyranny. The fact of the matter was, it was much more complicated than that. There were extremes on both sides. Let's call them Patriot Loyalists, but most people didn't really care, or they wanted things to stay the way they were. But as it became increasingly polarized and violent, people had to choose. And the Patriots were much more aggressive than the Loyalists in making others knuckle down. And because they had control of the colony beyond Boston, they turned the entire province into a Patriot stronghold.
You mentioned the militias. What was the makeup of those militias?
They were typically male inhabitants of a town, often farmers, artisans, that would come out for exercises on a fairly regular basis. And this dated back to the French and Indian Wars. And in the beginning, these were not the most well-practiced of amateur soldiers, but as tensions built throughout the summer of 74 into the fall and then the winter of 75, people began to practice once, sometimes twice a week, making sure that they were very well equipped. And this meant that as Gage was just trying to keep the lid on in Boston, the entire colony was arming and preparing
for war.
For war.
I thought it was interesting that you said that the militias were actually bigger than the British soldiers because they had healthier diets.
Yeah,
they were taller.
Physically, the New Englanders were bigger, an average 2 inches taller. And there's this one great anecdote. As tensions are building and Boston is becoming this British-occupied city under siege, a farmer from one of the outlying, they called them the country towns, comes in, and he's huge. He's like a Paul Bunyan. And he comes up to the British officers and he says, I'm 9 feet tall, but I'm short for my town. You better be careful. Yeah, we're coming for you.
You don't want to see the other guys in my town.
Yeah. So, can you imagine? These British soldiers did not want to be there. Gage and the other officers had no pleasure in fighting other Englishmen. And so it was a very difficult situation for them.
The book we're discussing is called Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution. Nathaniel Philbrick is a best-selling author, and he's in the studio with me. There are quite a few Loyalists, as you said, in Massachusetts. And in hindsight, it's kind of hard for us to understand why they would be loyal to Britain, given, the fervor of patriotic Americans and having your own country and being free.
Well, what many people don't realize is at the beginning, even the Patriots didn't want independence. What they were looking for was greater representation.
So these people right now were not really fighting for an independent nation.
In fact, they claimed to be loyal to King George. It was Parliament they were against. They called them the ministerial soldiers. And so it was very difficult for them to conceive of an independent nation. And so they still flew the British flag proudly. They regarded London as home, even though they had never been there. But and so it was almost a cellular metamorphosis going on, where they're beginning to as tensions built and violence would break out. They began to move towards a position no one wanted in the beginning. And so a loyalist was someone who said, I'm loyal to the mother country. Many of these people were merchants whose bread and butter was based on trade with London. And so they were obviously didn't have any problem with that relationship. And
saw quite a risk in taking them on.
Absolutely. And everyone saw it that way. But as one incident led to another, you find suddenly the word that no one says is in their vocabulary, independence, is actually being mentioned.
So the situation at Lexington, what brought those two armed groups together in the first place?
Yeah, well, Gage got an order that was several months old, and part of the problem was it was took a month for a ship to cross the Atlantic with an order, and then it had to go back, and so there's this huge communication gap. So Gage gets an order that has really nothing to do with the situation he's in, so he feels he has to do something. So he sends a couple of hundreds, about 500 British regulars to get the cannon and military stores that have been moving out of Boston and being stockpiled in Concord. And so off they go to do that. And that was what provoked Joseph Warren to tell Paul Revere to alert the countryside. And it was what alerted the militiamen in Lexington that there were soldiers coming their way. Now, what those Lexington militiamen had in mind is still unclear, because there was no way a handful of them could oppose a British army. But for a variety of reasons, they were there, and shots were fired. It's still in dispute.
Shots were fired in the passive voice.
Yes.
So we don't know.
We don't know who. Both sides claimed the other did. People died. Militiamen died. And this was the tinder that the fire required. And from then on, things were going to happen.
They fought again in Concord, then a few miles away.
Once again, there was a famous confrontation at the Old North Bridge where more people died, including British soldiers. And it was there that a British soldier was tomahawked in the head. And the British soldiers were under the impression that he had been scalped. And they were horrified by this. They were fighting savages in their own mind. And so as they made their way back to Boston, and the countryside became flooded with militiamen who were shooting at them, it was now edging from skirmishes towards a very bloody, house-to-house fighting that was terrifying to witness.
There was a spy named Benjamin Church.
Yes.
What was his motivation for spying for the British?
Well, in the beginning, it was very murky, which, what everyone wanted, peace. Everyone wanted this to be worked out. No one was talking independence. But Church had a high lifestyle, had a mistress, and was living way beyond his means, but he was a leading patriot. Gage offered to pay him a good amount of money if he would feed him secrets, what was going on. And so Church agreed to that. And it wouldn't be until after Bunker Hill that George Washington arrived that he would be revealed to be a spy. And for these patriots, it was like, how can this be? So one of ours has betrayed the cause.
But even Joseph Warren didn't realize that he was a spy.
No. And these were people who knew him intimately, worked with him. He was edgy, and that was part of his persona. No one thought he had the audacity to do what he had done.
So why did the Patriots believe that they could take on the British Army?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if at the beginning they thought that, but push came to shove. And Lexington and Concord provided them with proof that, hey, we can do some devastation to these British regulars. But it would be Bunker Hill that would really reveal that this was far different from what the British had anticipated. They assumed, okay, so maybe some farmers will shoot, but if they are presented in a battle where there's one army facing another, and it's one of the greatest armies in the world, the British regulars, marching toward them with their bayonets set,
they'll run away.
They'll run away, even if they're dug in. And what the Battle of Bunker Hill proved was they didn't run away. Even though they had the provincial soldiers had very low supplies of powder, they were ordered to hold their fire. We've all heard that famous phrase, hold your fire till you see the whites of their eyes. There's no proof that was definitely said. It could have been. We know someone said, hold your fire till you see the whites of their half gaiters, which is the splash guards on the regulars' feet. And that doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? But they, in any event, they held their powder in a very disciplined fashion until the soldiers were within 30 yards, unleashed a volley that had devastating effect. The British were driven back twice and suffered casualties of 50%, which is just horrendous. On the third charge, they would finally take the earthen redoubt or fort that they had built on Breed's Hill as opposed to Bunker Hill, which is an endless source of confusion. And the British would technically win, which I think a lot of Americans don't realize, because the ultimate losers of this war win this, but it is a truly Pyrrhic victory.
At a very high cost.
High cost. More than 1,000 soldiers either killed or wounded. As General Howe, who led the forces in this battle, said, the success is too dearly bought. And this was the wake-up call. It is no longer simply a rebellion. This is a war.
And the Patriots ended up having to flee because they ran out of gunpowder.
Yeah, as someone said, their fire went out like an old candle. They ran out of powder. In that fort, they were so desperate that they started throwing rocks. Some of them grabbed their muskets by the barrels and used them as to knock at the soldiers. It was terrible. And it was on this last charge that Joseph Warren was killed, reportedly waving a sword and trying to rally his men. And that would be the end of what up to then had been the Patriot leader in Boston.
Nathaniel Philbrick is in the studio with me. He's the best-selling author of Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution. Well, let's talk about the death of Joseph Warren, because what was he doing there to begin with in the middle of that very bloody battle?
Well, it really, a lot of people have said, what was he doing? Because this was, at this point, this 33-year-old, he had just had his birthday, so he's now 34. He was president of the Provincial Congress. He was head of the Committee of Safety, which functioned as the executive branch. So he was in charge of basically all branches of government. He was absolutely essential to the Patriot movement, and he was appointed a major general just days before the battle. Shouldn't he have been? Why did he put himself in harm's way?
Right. It's like having the Secretary of Defense in the middle of a battle. I mean,
Right.
we don't want to see him there.
And everyone told him no, no, no. And he said he was a passionate guy, rash, and he was highly ambitious. And the way to become a hero is bravery on the battlefield. And he had his own personal demons as well. And he said, I think he had 60 days of nonstop adrenaline rush. He was organizing this entire thing. I think he was exhausted. And he said, how can I not risk my life when I know all of these men are fighting for me? And so he very romantically went out there, and he died tragically. But it didn't necessarily have to happen. And I think he could have been such an asset to Washington when he arrived about 10 days later as the leader.
So you said that Bunker Hill, everybody realized now, both sides realize we're at war.
Right.
Was it at that point where we're fighting for independence?
No. No, not yet. No, we're just fighting to make the Brits say, okay, let's talk. No, independence had not mentioned yet. We're still vowing our loyalty to King George because we know he loves us deeply, and it's the Parliament and his ministry that's misleading him. It's that fall after the Battle of Bunker Hill that we have the first record of Washington's generals talking about independence. The word is being used. They're refusing to toast the king. Up until this point, they're toasting the king. January 1st, there's a new army, and many of the old recruits, but a lot of new recruits. But Washington puts up a flag. It's still the British flag. And so, I think, once again, I don't think many of us realize how difficult it was for people. But then Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense that winter, and that's what changes the tide. He says, wait a minute. It's about time we start looking at this rationally. We are this big country with millions of people. Britain is a small island 3,000 miles away. It is time that we take our destiny in our own hands and declare ourselves independent. And that's what would happen, of course, famously in July of 1776. And so it all changes.
You said that right after Bunker Hill, a few days later, George Washington comes on the scene, and his job is now to create a continental army. Had Joseph Warren survived, would he have been the one in charge of that continental army? Or would it still have been George Washington?
Well, it's interesting. Washington was appointed head of the Continental Army with John Adams and Samuel Adams, pushing for it because they realized, how do we keep people from thinking New England's going to try to attack us, within the colonies? We put a Virginian at the head. And so his appointment occurred during the Battle of Bunker Hill, but since it took weeks for the word to get there, he would have been the new head. And Joseph Warren, you can see, he even thought that Washington should be the head even before he died. I don't think anyone would have had any issue with that. And I think one of the tragic what-ifs is if Washington would have terrible problems with this ragtag band of New Englanders who, didn't take orders because they had grown up with town meetings where, you talk about things and you reach a consensus. And so when their officers would tell them to do stuff, they said, wait a minute, we have to talk about this before we
let's
do
think
it.
about this.
Let's think
all
about
talk.
this. Washington comes from a Virginian hierarchical society, and he goes, what is going on? And he was not impressed. If there had been someone like Joseph Warren as one of Washington's council of war, one of his underlings, to sort of say, hey, I can help you here, I think it would have been a much easier transition.
After several months of a very tense standoff in Boston, the British decide to just pack up and leave.
Yeah.
Why did they decide that?
Well, it was forced upon them. Even before that, they were hopeful of leaving because they knew now that it's a war, we don't want to fight it in Boston. We want to move south where it's going to be strategically better. We're going to go, and they would ultimately go to New York that summer. But what forced them to evacuate, it's a great story where a bookseller named Henry Knox, everything he knew about artillery, he was the head of the artillery regiment, he learned in books. And Washington appointed him, he was only 25 years old, and he gives him the job of getting the cannons that are in Fort Ticonderoga, 300 miles away to the north on Lake Champlain, during the winter, load them on sleds, and drag them across the snow to Boston. And he would achieve that in a matter of months. And those cannons, perched atop Dorchester Heights, were what forced William Howe, who replaced Gage as the head of the Army, forced them to evacuate in March 1776.
But George Washington didn't know that they were planning on evacuating. And he was thinking, we're going to just have to torch Boston, essentially.
Right. And, this is a young Washington. He's in his early 40s. He's not the stoic icon that we see on the dollar bill. He was appalled by these militiamen. He wanted to get this over with. And he said, we've got to attack. We don't have much gunpowder. We're going to have less if we wait. But that was insanity. And that's what his council of war told him, at least, several times when he kept proposing. They said, no, hold off. And it's a good thing because it would have meant the destruction of Boston and perhaps Washington's own army. You have to, Washington knew his generals were predisposed to do this. So he may have been using this as kind of a dramatic teaching moment to say, we need to be pushing. And the fact of the matter is, though, the other thing he was doing was turning this ragtag band into a true army. And I think that's where the real achievement of George Washington was during the siege of Boston.
Nathaniel, I want to bring you to more recent history with the Arab revolutions.
Yeah.
And, when those first started, we were all excited about it. And we were like, oh, yay, they're going to have a revolution and they're going to be free like us. And things didn't really turn out very well. I mean, Arab Spring turned to Islamist winter.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm not saying it's easy to have a revolution because it's not. Violence is one thing. The miracle of the American Revolution is that there was enough coherence in society to create a society that was functioning, not very prettily during the long war for independence, but enough of a bud, let's say, of a new society to ultimately flourish. The problem is it requires a lot of political infrastructure, and you have to have leaders, and you have to have consensus, and that is very hard to put together amidst the chaos of a revolution.
Nathaniel Philbrick, he's a best-selling author. The book is Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution. It's published by Viking. Nathaniel, thanks so much for being on the program.
Oh, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks.